Boker Tov, everyone. Before we start learning, I also want to note that here in the States, it is Veterans Day, and we do want to dedicate this class to our soldiers, the men and women, not only those who have served, but those who have sacrificed a great deal, not necessarily in their lives, but there are a lot of challenges to being in the military service, to raising a family. Also for different genders, there are different challenges. And we want to recognize that it's not as simple as just showing up. There's a lot that people have to often give up to be able to protect and serve our country. So we share our gratitude with them. We are continuing today in the story of Yaakov and his journey from becoming, in some ways, mother's favorite to becoming the leader of what will become a great nation. And last week, where we left off, is where Yaakov, pushed by his mother Rivka, had to seemingly trick his father into giving the blessing. Now, there's a lot of questions about whether that actually works, whether the decision of who the blessing goes to is by man or by God, or whether Yitzchak, even though his son Yaakov was tricking him, maybe Yitzchak was fully aware what was going on. So regardless of who has the power to give blessings and how Yitzchak was aware, maybe Yitzchak, even though he loved Esav more, knew that Yaakov was the one to take over for the family. Regardless, the response from Esav was understandable, but quite extreme, and that he started chasing after his brother. At least that was the assumption that Yaakov had. So now Yaakov is running away from home, trying to get to a safe place. And on the way, he's tired because he's been running for a long time, and he decides to take a nap. And this leads to one of the most famous stories in the Torah. The story is often called, hello, Frank, hello, Asher. The story is, that's not the name of the story. The story is often called Jacob's Ladder, or Sulam Yaakov. Yaakov is Hebrew name. Now, the word Sulam, I believe, is one of these words we've talked about before, Hapax Legamemnon, meaning there's no other word like it anywhere else in the Torah. So we have to make a lot of assumptions about its meaning. And to translate it as ladder, it's a possibility, and that's how we translate it today in modern Hebrew, but it's really unlikely that it was just a ladder. Practically speaking, I mean, they probably had ladders back then, but the idea of angels, what he sees in the dream is angels descending to heaven, ascending to heaven and then descending from heaven, and then God is standing at the top. And that's also a question, how could he see God? But it's a dream, so things don't have to be logical, so it could be a ladder. But what's more likely is that in the days and geographical location of Yaakov, the temples to gods in general were these ramped ziggurats. It was kind of like a pyramid, but instead of being smooth on all sides, it had steps going up. Hello, Sherman, welcome. And this was the way that people would reach the gods, as they would walk up these steps towards the top of the pyramid that reached into the heavens, metaphorically. So it makes sense that Yaakov, who was exposed to these sort of ramped ziggurats, that this is what he would have pictured in his dream as the mode of reaching to heaven, the way the angels. And in fact, many modern translations translate that word sulam as ramp, or a ramped something. So that was sort of a tangential point. The focus that we're going to look at today is the moment that Yaakov wakes up. And he has this realization that we'll read in just a moment, where he says, I didn't know God was here. If I had known God was here, I wouldn't have taken a nap. But what does it mean that he realizes God is there? Couldn't he have just woken up and say, that dream inspired me? How does he know that it was God? What does it mean that he has this realization all of a sudden? And the rabbis pick up on that, and some of them try and just understand it in a contextual, literal sense, what was going on in his head. But some of them use that idea of, I didn't realize God was here, something happened to me, and now I recognize God's presence. They use it as an almost jumping off point for philosophy or for other beautiful ideas. And we're going to explore some of those ideas in today's class. So before we begin, any questions before we jump in? Excellent. Isabel, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you first, and I'll have you please read the first source, which is just the description of what I said, and then the first commentary on it. So go ahead. Source number one, please, Isabel.
Yaakov awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. Shaken, he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the abode of God. and that is the gateway to heaven.
Thank you, Isabel. Now, before I have you read source number 2, a few interesting things here. One, of course, is that moment of awareness. I didn't realize that God was in this place. And we also, as we read this, and we'll see the later commentaries mention, but isn't God in every place? What does it mean that God is specifically in this place? And the rabbis will pick up on that. And then Yaakov continues and says, he's emotionally shaken. This place is awesome in the true sense of the word. Not like an awesome hot chocolate, but truly full of that great sense of awe. And he says, this is God's place of dwelling and a gateway to heaven. Now, again, that doesn't really jive with the modern, generally popular Jewish understanding that God is everywhere. But he says specifically in this place that I feel the presence of God. So we're going to look again at a few different ways that the rabbis respond to it. So Isabel, if you want to take source number 2 from 12th century Avraham, Ibn Ezra, please.
Surely the Lord is in this place. The meaning of Yaakov's statement is that there are places where miracles are seen. I cannot explain why this is so, but is a deep mystery.
So he takes the statement of Ibn Ezra takes the statement of Yaakov at face value, which is there are specific locations, particularly this location, where certain supernatural things can be seen or felt. That seems to be what Yaakov is saying. This is magical is not the right word, but this is a specifically holy divine place. And Ibn Ezra says, I have no idea why that specific place. There's a great mystery here, and human beings we can't understand it. But the simple understanding is that specific location where he happened to take a nap is a unique place on earth, and there's no other place like it. Milwaukee's a special place, number 1 in a Twitter poll for best city in the US, but it's not one of those places. But where Yaakov took a nap, if any of us were to stumble upon that place and take a nap, something would likely happen to us. There's something distinct about that specific physical place. Thank you, Isabel, Gloria, and Leonard. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And now Sforno is going to take kind of take that to the next level and make it not just about that specific spot where he slept, but more general. There is a place on earth, the most magical place on earth, where things like this happen. So Gloria, go ahead, source number 3.
Before I read it, I just wanted to say, perhaps it was dark when he arrived there and he fell asleep. And then when he woke up, it was light. And perhaps it was just an awe-inspiring place. I remember when I was in camp as a camper, and we used to hike in the mountains in New York. And we got to the top of a mountain, and I felt exactly that way. Wow, God is here. It was just so beautiful that it was awe-inspiring. So, maybe that's a possibility.
Not only is it a beautiful possibility, I could be wrong, but I think I may have read one commentary I didn't include who mentioned something like that. He didn't recognize the place because he arrived at night. When he woke up, he was like, oh, I know this place, but I didn't realize it. And again, I think Rashi commented something to the effect of, had he realized it was that sacred place, he wouldn't have taken a nap there. He would have taken it all in. And one of the things as we're reading through this, particularly the last 2 sources, is how can this speak to us today? What does it mean for somebody to have that Yaakov moment of recognizing God in a place where he didn't see God before? So these first 2 sources are saying it's not about us internally, it's about the location itself. And which is what you're implying, there's certain locations that bring something out of us. It might have been in us all along, but it's the location itself. But then we're going to shift to perhaps it's something about the person, something that was waiting to come out. But we'll see how they explicate it. So go ahead, Gloria, source number 3.
Can you just read the Hebrew first?
Oh, sure. It's from the verse. Achen yesh Hashem b'makom hazeh.
There can be no question that this is a location from where the gift of prophetic insights is dispensed. Seeing that I have been granted such an insight without even having expected it or prepared myself for it spiritually. It is a fact that the characteristics of a person undergo changes in the land of Israel, just as the climate and the air in this country are different, contributing to one's mental and spiritual progress. Our sages have phrased this as the very air of the land of Israel makes one wiser.
Thank you. In many ways, this kind of expands upon the idea of Ibn Ezra. So it's not just that place where he napped, it's the entire land of Israel. And he was not a prophet before. He had not experienced God's presence before. And then as soon as he walks in the land, he starts getting prophecies. So if you see in these films and TV shows where the characters are searching for, like the fountain of youth, there's one physical location where all of the magic and power emanates from. To the rabbis, that prophecy emanates from the land of Israel. So even though we don't have prophecy per se today, if we did, one would only be able to achieve it if they were in the physical land of Israel. But again, it's literally about so people who want to go to Israel and bring back some dirt with them, it's not meaningless. It's not just a symbolic thing. There are rabbinic sources that imply that the actual physical material of the land of Israel has a spiritual impact on the people who are there. It's the power of the land itself. And Yaakov had never experienced that before. Eventually, it would become a regular thing for him. He would have all of these miraculous spiritual events, but it's not so much about not recognizing God. He knew of God. His father and grandfather had taught him about Hashem and about God. But this idea of being able to connect to God, he had never been able to do it before. Any questions before we go on to the next source? Excellent. This next source here. So, oh yeah, go ahead, Gloria.
Eliezer, he's the one that Isaac sent to get a wife for Jacob.
So it's not explicitly written in the text. It just says he sends his, servant or whatever. But the tradition holds that it is Eliezer. Yes.
So that's sort of like a miracle too, that he comes to exactly the right place and finds Rebecca. I mean, I guess.
But the interesting thing about it is, and we'll see a little bit of a shift in these last sources, is one of the things I'm pointing out here is that it's about the land itself. It's not about the person. Like, the people can't have these sort of divine awakenings if they're not physically in the land of Israel. So that's the way that these rabbis take it. And now we're going to take a slightly different direction it's more about a philosophical journey about what it means to have that awakening. I didn't realize God was here. It wasn't about the fact that he knew about God. He just didn't know that there was a kind of magic to the physical land of Israel. Whereas some of those instances, either they depend on the land itself, or they depend on God's. And in fact, the next one is going to talk about God getting involved in the world, hashgacha pratit, divine providence. And that could happen, depending on how you look. It can only happen in Israel. God only gets directly involved in people's lives in Israel, or God can do it anywhere. Obviously, our simple answer is God can do it anywhere. But here, the rabbis are implying that Jacob's realization is that if one really wants to connect to God, they need to be in Israel. So these are good sources for people who are pushing people to make aliyah to Israel. This next source here that I'll take, and then Leonard, I will come back to, but this next one is long and it's very philosophical. It's not very complex, but I just want to work us through it. Is in a work Akedat Yitzchak, 15th century, and this work is an incredible commentary on the Torah, and it often goes into very complex philosophical breakdowns to try and understand what's happening in the Torah. So he actually had this whole introduction that I felt actually convoluted the fact. So I jumped into his example, trying to prove his point, and the idea that he's presenting, I think, will come out of his point. So after his dream, meaning Yaakov's dream, he was able to exclaim, "Indeed, the Lord is in this place, although such a thought had been furthest from my mind," says Yaakov, and that's the approximate translation of it. This newfound insight had been contradicted by Jacob's thought processes on several accounts. So the key here that the Akedat Yitzchak, this work, is talking about is when Yaakov has this realization, what was he realizing? It wasn't simply, I didn't know God was here. There were a lot of things that were in his head, ideas that he had never thought of before that went against his understanding of the nature of the universe. So, A, the assumption that God is subject to physical dimensions, as we humans use the term, had been quite alien to Jacob. He was amazed to learn that God has a permanent residence on earth. And by the way, again, today, we often think the opposite, but Yaakov didn't know that God could focus God's self on one place. And if you look at contemporary rabbis, they might say, no, God really is everywhere. but God's presence can be felt more in places. So however you explain it, there are certain physical places where God's presence is definitely more present. B, the idea that God moves from place to place accompanying people would never have occurred to him had this fact not been revealed to him. And this is so important for Yaakov because he is essentially exiling himself from his home. He's in the middle of nowhere. He's terrified. Why would he think that the God of his father and grandfather would go with him? And then he realizes God came with me. God is with me in my terrified state. God will follow me wherever I go. He didn't realize that. He thought if I run away from home, I'm running away from God too. And C, the thought that God's movements, as it were, could be brought about by outside influences. In other words, were not completely self-induced, had likewise been beyond Jacob's wildest imaginations, that certain actions could cause God or influence God or push God to pop up where God is needed. Jacob didn't realize that could happen, like prayer. And a lot of rabbis pick up on this and say Yaakov had already kind of done a prayer in the middle of a field. Or sorry, that was Yitzchak, but Yaakov had a prayer. This is the source for Yaakov praying in the evening. In theology, the points just mentioned were thought completely impossible. Jacob would not have dared think of the Creator in those terms. God did not mean to demolish the theories Jacob had believed in. He wanted merely to broaden Jacob's spiritual horizons. The concept of hashgacha pratit, personal providence by God, which, depending on who you ask, can mean as simple as somebody's about to step off the curb and God pulls them back so they don't get hit by a bus, or something more major like saving Yaakov in the desert or the wilderness, was the idea conveyed to Jacob in his dream. Philosophy, though it succeeds in arriving at many valid conclusions about God, about his uniqueness, his existence, etc., nevertheless misses a great deal, as discussed in chapter 7 and 48. Isaiah chapter 66, verse 1 summarizes the lesson Jacob was taught in his dream in the following words. Thus says the Lord, the heaven are my throne and the earth is my footstool. On the one hand, the infinite dimensions of God are described in a manner that precludes us from imagining God as bound by space. Since anyone who can consider the whole earth as his footstool can hardly be contained by man-made structures such as the temple. And I don't know if he'll mention it here, but many rabbis say that that specific place where Yaakov had his dream is where they build the Beit HaMikdash. And that's a midrashic idea that comes back again and again when Yitzchak was out in the field doing lasuach and he was potentially praying to God. That's where the Beit HaMikdash was. When Avraham almost sacrificed his son Yitzchak, that's where the Beit HaMikdash would ultimately stand. Again, there's no proof or evidence that that location is it, but the rabbis always say there's something about that location, which gives more meaning to people who go to the Western Wall today. On the other hand, if such a being exceeds the whole earth in size, how can such a being move from place to place since it already occupies more than all the space available? So he's talking about the idea that God is simply everywhere and fills everything. Also, how could such a being be in need of anything, seeing it as it has proclaimed, and this is from Tehillim, mine is the universe and all that is therein. Therefore, God asks, what kind of house can you possibly build for me? God asks rhetorically, why did I command building a temple to dwell therein? So if God can't exist in a house, why does God say, build me a house? Surely not for my need, but for your sake. Man's logic would not have dared presume all this, had it not been revealed to him. When a king moves his residence away from the capital to one of the country's rural centers, he does so for the benefit of his subjects in that region, who will reap economic and cultural advantages by harboring royalty in their midst. In other words, a human king can move around. He could say, I'm going to live in Milwaukee for a week and it's going to help your economy. However, it is important that his subjects realize what is being done for them and that they be made aware of their former inferior status. This is the reason God says, I will look towards the poor and low-spirited who relate to my word with a feeling of awe. So God's natural inclination is not to live in specific places, but God knows that the only way that we can connect with God is for God's presence to be focused on one location. We need God to be in a specific place because we can't be everywhere. The ones who are aware of their limitations and wish to uplift themselves deserve my special attention, says God. Only when we realize the limitation of our powers of perception, grieve over it, and long to expand our spiritual horizons, will God grant us greater insights. I want to pause there for a moment and read that one more time, because that's kind of the most important takeaway of this whole piece, because that's really what happened to Yaakov. In that moment, Akedat Yitzchak will say that, in that moment, Yaakov realized, I didn't even know where to find God. Forget about this place. I didn't realize God was here. I didn't know where God was. I didn't realize there could be a place where one could feel God. Only when we realize the limitations of our powers of perception, grieve over it, and long to expand our spiritual horizons, will God grant us greater insights. So if somebody says, I feel God in everything, I know God's presence everywhere, that person might be lying to themselves. But the person who says, I don't know where God is, I want to feel God, I'm seeking God, I wish that I had more spiritual awareness, then God might make God's self known. And this is something that a lot of rabbis talk about, is God is there. We're just not aware of it. We're not open to it. So the person whose ego says, I know where I can talk to God anytime I want, maybe that's an ego thing. But the person who says, God, I'm looking for you, please help me find you, that's when the person might find God. And that's exactly what Yaakov did. Yaakov was terrified. Yaakov didn't think God went with him. He didn't understand how God worked. And he wished that, I'm so afraid. I wish God were with me. Please, God, I wish you were with me. And then God came to him in a dream. How does all this, now the Akedat Yitzchak, how does all this relate to Jacob's dream? Over a period of time, Jacob had acquired concepts of the grandeur of God, his uniqueness, his power, his being the prime mover of history, to the extent that an unassisted human intellect is able to perceive all this. So he had learned from his father and his grandfather about the greatness of God. At the end of Parashat Toldot, we have already read that Jacob went to Padan Aram. We hear now that he first went to Beersheba to inform us, as our sages relate, that he spent 14 years studying, preparing himself to the extent that such preparation is possible without divine inspiration. So this is a little bit of a midrashic ending, and it's actually not as powerful as the ending Akedat Yitzchak before he said about Jacob. But the implication that Akedat Yitzchak has here is that Yaakov wanted to experience God and spent years not doing other stuff, but trying to study perhaps in a yeshiva or trying to recognize God. Now, we do know that these men and women in the Torah did try and seek out God. They prayed to God. So the idea that he might have spent a significant portion of his life trying to find God, that's not crazy. That's not anachronistic. Abraham did it, Yitzchak did it. All of the people in the Torah are trying to find God. But it has to start with a recognition that they are powerless, that they can only find God if God wants to be found by them, and they need to recognize their limitations. So this piece by the Akedat Yitzchak is very powerful for us. When we come to prayer, if we expect that when we talk and we say, God always listens, maybe that's true. But if we really want to experience God and make an awareness of God, we need to recognize that we're limited. We're limited, and we need to ask God to reveal God's self to us. So before we read the final piece, any questions or thoughts up until now? And welcome, Tamar. Excellent. So Leonard, I promised you this last piece, and it's a very, very short one. It's actually from a contemporary website, but it summarizes some beautiful ideas from some Hasidic rabbis that I think can speak very powerfully to us, and goes back to the question about, was it that Yaakov's realization was that the land was holy, or the realization that he had the power in him all along to discover God? So the Akedat Yitzchak is implying that he did have that power all along. It wasn't about the land. It was about him having this humility and this realization that if he opened himself up fully, then God would be revealed to him. Whereas the first rabbi said, no, it wasn't about Yaakov. It was about where Yaakov was. Nothing changed in Yaakov. It was the only thing that changed is where he was. So those are two different directions now, where Yaakov was changed or Yaakov himself changed. And again, that speaks to us as we're on our spiritual journeys. What might be holding us back? Is it because we're not in the right community? We're not in the right house? We're not in the right whatever part of our life? Or is it something internal in us? And if we can unlock that internal awareness, then we'll become aware of God. So this last piece from David Elcott, just a contemporary writer, Leonard, please.
Yaakov awakens from his sleep and says, surely there is God in this place, and I did not know it. What is it that he did not know. Two Hasidic masters provide contrary to yet equally remarkable insight for us. Each responds to Yaakov's confusion over God's presence. One explains the place where God was found was in the I, the self of Jacob, Yaakov. Consumed with anger, fear, and deceit, Yaakov suddenly becomes aware of the potential divinity within himself, the place where God can reside.
So that's like the Akedah Yitzhak. That's the personal, was always within his power to discover God, but something needed to change about him. But what's interesting is what does change in this dream? Because Yaakov doesn't really do anything. So that's why the Akedah Yitzhak is implying, well, he had been studying, he'd been preparing for 14 years for this moment. And it finally, after all of his studying and practicing, he discovered God, but that's not really implied by the text. So the second, go ahead, Leonard, intuits the opposite.
The second intuits the opposite. At the very moment that Yaakov becomes aware of God's presence, he exclaims, "It is I, the self, that I do not know." Only when I am filled with myself, or rather, only when I am not filled with myself, when I empty myself of the ego and self-serving explanations that encrust me,
Like
can
fill him up and like scar him over so he can't break out and discover new things.
Can I truly experience God's presence? Both remind us how ever-present God can be and how easy it is to say, but I did not know.
Excellent. So both of these ideas were in some ways explored in the previous piece, the Akedah Yitzhak, but here they said beautifully and clearly, which is the idea that somebody just, comes with this ego to the table. So I know how to discover God. Maybe I didn't realize it, but I have that power within me, versus the second one, which is my ego is getting in the way, thinking that I have this power, that I can discover God wherever I look, as opposed to saying that I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to find God. I want to find God. I have that sincere desire, but I am getting in the way of my own self. God, please help unlock and open my heart. The beginning of the Amidah, Hashem Sfatai Tiftach, God, open my lips, as opposed to saying, I am a poet and I know exactly what to say to get God's attention, versus I don't know what to say. Please, God, give me the words. And those are two different texts. And the one that I would push certainly is the second one, which is that our egos often get in the way of a genuine religious experience. Somebody who believes that they have mastered religion, they have mastered spirituality, they can do some sort of ceremony. And this is not just in Judaism, in many religions, they know exactly how to reach the divine. And we have people like this, and maybe they genuinely think they can, but oftentimes it's just their egos. They're so convinced of their own brilliance that they're like, God couldn't ignore me. Well, by you saying God can't ignore you, what you're really doing is you're ignoring God. So what we need to do is to have a genuine experience. And this doesn't mean that we're going to start having prophetic dreams in the night, that we're going to hear the voice of God as clearly as Moses did. But our prayer experience, if we go into it saying, God, you have to listen to me because I have a sitter in my hand, versus I don't know what I'm doing. I am lost. God, please help me find my way. It is in those moments of utter vulnerability. And no one was more vulnerable than Yaakov, alone in that field in that night, filled with guilt and anger and deceit. It is only in those moments of true vulnerability that we open ourselves up to recognizing miracles, God's presence, and even the human around us, others who can help us. We don't see them when we're convinced that we can take care of ourselves, that we can do it ourselves. But when we recognize that we need the other, there becomes space for the other, whether that's the divine or just someone in our life who's reaching out to help us. So it's a powerful moment with Yaakov's recognition of his humanity and his vulnerability. And each of us would be so lucky to have that moment of vulnerability, but then to have someone or some being who loves us reach out and say, I am here with you wherever you go, which is exactly what God says.